So when did you get your first tattoo, man?
I was 21.
21.
And I got this chest piece. It's Greek, and it actually says "Seize the Night."
Seize the night. I like
Seize
that.
the night, yeah.
I like
You
that a
know,
lot.
instead of seize the day, because
Right.
as Christians, we're called to be the light. So it's all about, being the light in the darkness.
Yeah.
Oh, I was actually gonna ask you about a Mike Tyson right here.
It could be arranged.
I am so excited to be with you today. I am glad that you're here. I know that you could be a million different places, but at both of our campuses, we are just delighted that you have spent time with us today. Let me ask this question. Now, this is for real. How many have said, like, I've done something with the best of intentions, but it just turned out poor? Anybody? You just had the best of intentions going into it, it just turned out poor. I remember when I was a kid, maybe 20, 21, 22 years old, a small group of us, we were going way up into Canada to do this kind of fun weekend at a kind of a cabin in the woods on a lake kind of a deal. And my buddies and I, we were all traveling together, and we get to the border crossing at Canada. Now, this was in a different era, right, altogether. It was like kind of low key back then. Anybody remember this? Anybody remember? You know what I'm talking about? Kind of low key. So we get up to the American side, and everything goes well. Hey, what are you guys doing? We're going to Canada. It's going to be great. Spend the weekend. It's going to be awesome. And no problems. We get over the thing, going into to Canada over the bridge. And the guards, they kind of come around. They got the little mirror thing, and they're doing the whole dog thing, and they're looking around. And one of the guards kind of looks into the window and goes, what are you guys doing? We explained the whole deal. And then he asks, well, do you have anything that you shouldn't have on your possession? And true story, my buddy in the back, with the best of intentions, just trying to keep the atmosphere light, he goes, yeah, we got a bazooka. He literally says, yeah, I got a bazooka. And I remember I was driving, I was just a kid, I'm like, what did you just say? And of course, because we're just young and dumb kids, they have to make a point out of it. And they're like, all right. They literally surround the car, off to the side. And like 5 hours later, they conclude that we do not have a bazooka in our vehicle. Best of intentions, poor results. And I think a whole bunch of us get out of bed and we intend to go for it. We intend the best of intentions with our life, and we start strong. We're fully committed. We are on board. And then it just doesn't take long for us to stumble. It doesn't take long for us to go from good to bad to even worse. And it begins this like spin cycle in our life. Anybody know what I'm talking about? Like, anybody ever decide to lose some weight? Anybody? Best of intentions. It starts off good for a day and a half, right? Or anybody in the room decide you're gonna watch less TV, exercise a little bit more, read a little bit more, something like that. Anybody? And that lasts for about a day and a half, right? Or you're gonna spend less and you're gonna invest more. You have the best of intentions, but it just turns out poor. It just doesn't go the way that we want it to go. And friends, I think it is the same thing in our spirit. In our relationship with God, we have the best of intentions. A lot of times we come into an environment like this and there's something that is sparked inside of our soul, something that is stirred inside of us, and we begin to take these steps forward, but something happens about a day and a half later. The soul of who we are just kind of gets sucked away from us. And we struggle. We start off strong with the best of intentions. But if we were honest, the results are sometimes less than what we intended. Poor results. And so the Apostle Paul, this man who God uses to write much of the New Testament part of the Bible to us, he is this ex-murderer. Now, it's almost hard to conceive of this, but this guy's job was literally to stop the spread of the Christian church. That's what he was engaged in on a full-time basis. His role was to find little churches like ours and make sure that they come to an end. That's his role. And on his journey to stamp out one of these little Christian churches that was on the rise, he has this very spiritual encounter, and he meets Jesus. Literally, it says that Christ appears to him. And I know that sounds kind of weird, but something must have been true of this, because all we know was this very famous person in history, a guy named Paul, who we call Paul the Apostle. He was completely in one direction, and all of a sudden he has this spiritual encounter, and now he is completely heading in another direction. And so Paul, a lot like some of us, he comes out of a little bit of a shady background, to say the least, right? He didn't always get it right. And so now Paul, God is using him to write the Christian church, and that would be people like us. And so he writes to this church in the city of Galatia. It's a Roman city. It is a very, very pagan city. And he begins to write to them about the best of intentions, but listen, a very poor result. And so here's what he says in Galatians chapter 5. He says it like this. Listen. He says, now this is going to kind of sound a little bit redundant at first, but he's making a statement here. He says it like this. He says, it is for freedom that Christ has set us free. It is for freedom that Christ has set us free. And you think, no, duh, when you set somebody free, you actually set them free for a reason, to give them freedom, right? And so you're thinking, okay, what are you trying to say to us? Is there a bigger picture going on here? So he says, it is for freedom. There's a reason that Christ set you free. It is for freedom that Christ set you free. And then he says these words, and this is the challenge. He says this, he says, stand firm then. Stand firm. Because there's a possibility that you won't stand firm. There's a reason he set you free. And so he's telling you again, stand firm. Freedom, living in this spiritual freedom, is not going to come easy. And here's the big part. Here's what he says. He says this. He says, so it is for freedom that Christ has set you free. Stand firm then, and listen, and do not let yourselves be burdened again by the yoke of slavery. In other words, there is this implication here that you can come to Christ and have this moment of freedom, where you can have this spiritual light bulb go on, where you can meet the God who is your creator. You can have this divine moment, this divine intervention, that you can be born again, but then something might happen that stops you from the intent of what that born again experience was. Because his intent was that you would be set free for freedom's sake, that you would be truly free, that you wouldn't fall back, that you would be free. And that, in other words, he was thinking that there would be this spiritual progress, that we would progress in our freedom, and that there would continue in us this spiritual growth, so that later in our life, maybe 5 or 10 or 15 years from now, that you won't be the same, that you will what? Progress, that you will be actually not only free, but that you would be more free. Because you're not sliding back, because you're not going back to who you were, that you would look at your life and say, I am more free now than I was 5 or 10 or 15 years ago. Anybody tracking with me here? Anybody at all? And I know right out of the box, we get all philosophical and we get all theological on you, but just track with me, and I think you're going to get your mind around this. He says that it is for freedom's sake that Christ has set you free. And that leaves open the option that you can come to faith through Christ and end up not being free. That you can come to faith, that you can meet the Son of God, that you can be born anew, that you can be born again and not stand firm in that. That something will pull you back into the yoke of slavery. He says, and do not let yourselves be burdened again by the yoke of slavery. Do not let yourself be pulled back into something that is going to hold you. And friends, in other words, at some point later in your life, there will be the temptation to slide backwards, to move back to the very things from which you came. That there will be this spin cycle in your life, this spiritual spin cycle. And if I could just kind of reinterpret what Paul is saying, he says, how crazy is that? He says, how crazy is that you would meet the Son of God? He says that you would come into a relationship with your Creator and find this moment of spiritual rebirth, and that you would want to go back to who you were. He says, how stinking crazy is that? That you would be at one point free, and then later that you would not be free. that you would go back to this me-centered existence, this entertain me-centered existence, this self-focused existence, that it's all about me, that you would know who God is and not progress toward him. Come on, you hear me? He says, this is crazy. Paul was saying, I know what it means to be far from God because I live far from God. And I know what it means to be set free from all the temptation of this world that says, I'm living for the approval of this world. I'm living for the approval of men, that I'm living for the approval of those I work with and serve with, that I'm living for approval of my girlfriend, my boyfriend, my husband, my wife, my children, my parents, that I'm living for the approval of all of these temporal things in our world. He says, I know what it's like to live like that. And he says, I am not going back. He says, God set me free from that. The kind of freedom where it is a soul type of freedom, where I can learn to love the God who created me and follow the God who created me and want more of him and less of me in my life. Friends, this is more than just a call to, quote, be saved. This is more than a call that says you can know who God is and God can love you and forgive you. This is a call to freedom. This is a call to having a whole new birth in your life that would result in more and more and more freedom. But friends, here is what I struggle with. I think a whole bunch of Christian people, even in our community of faith, hope, and love, I think a whole bunch of us can be Christian, yes, have a born-again experience, yes, have a divine moment, yes, but you can still be in the yoke of slavery. And I fear, friends, that it is very possible here today in our little Christian community that several years later, that many of you have come to this moment of knowing God, but you are in more captivity today than you ever were in your whole life. That there was something that happened in you, and you had this moment of release and moment of relief inside of you, that the Spirit of God came and take up residence inside of you, and you were like, woo, woo, I don't even know what to do with this. I don't know what to do with this. But now, 5 or 10 or 15 or 20 years later, you're in more bondage than you ever were. Listen to me. You are more a slave today than you were when you started. And I don't think that is God's intent, because it says this in the scripture, that he who the Son sets free is free indeed. That he set you free so that you would really be free, so that you really would not go back, that it would be so good, it would taste so good that you would want more of it, that you would progress in your freedom, that you would progress in your soul, that your soul would grow. And so last week, we started this series called Marked. Anybody here for that? Anybody? Both of our campuses? We started this series called Marked, and it carried this idea that when you come to know who God is, that it is more than just grace that covers you. It is more than just forgiveness that starts something new inside of you. But that grace marks you, that you are branded, that your soul is tattooed, and that you are called to live out this faith, that Jesus is supposed to become more and more and more in your life, and that the Spirit of God tattoos you, he marks you, and that your life is supposed to look more like him every single day. It's a journey. And so we're getting around this idea of what does it mean to live out our faith in a culture that has little faith, that does not want this to happen. What does it mean to be a marked follower of Jesus? And we're going to get around over the next 6 weeks a bunch of big ideas of what I think it means to follow Christ. I think it's more complicated than some of the stuff that we're going to lay out. But let me tell you, I think there's some basics that we just have to come to understand. And that's what we're going to get around. Are you guys okay with that? Is that cool? Is that cool? Woo, okay. And so here's where I think we begin with this whole journey, is I think the first mark of a follower is freedom. It's the kind of soul freedom. It is a new spirit set down deep inside of you after experiencing the forgiveness of God, after experiencing the grace of God. If you notice, I didn't start with grace. I'm saying that grace, if you're going to follow him, it results in freedom in your life, that you no longer live for the applause of man, but that you are concerned with the heartbeat of God, that you're concerned that your life is reflecting who he is, that you love him, that you want to know him, and that you want to follow him with every part of who you are. I remember getting a series of letters a few years back, and it was from a kid who grew up in my student ministry. And this kid was, he came from a troubled home. He really did. He kind of came from the other side of the tracks, if you can kind of go with that. Just a real difficult life. And but underneath of the rough facade, he was a good kid. He had a great smile, I remember that. And he had a real soft heart toward God. And it was almost strange because of the world he came out of. He had this really soft heart toward God. And I remember him coming, and he was kind of one of those tough type of kids, but he had a soft heart. I knew it. And one day, I remember as clear as day that we were in our basement, and we had this student gathering at our house, and I was talking about the love of God, the grace of God, and in a moment, his shell cracked. And he accepted the love of Christ into his life. And I remember this, and I don't know about you, but for me as a Christian, when somebody else comes to faith, it is just so exciting to me. And it never gets old to me, never. And I remember this, and this kid, he has this moment where he connects to God. But fast forward a few years later, when this series of letters starts to come to me, I hadn't seen him in a while. Every once in a while, he would show up at church with a girlfriend and a couple kids that he had, and you could tell life was still a struggle, up and down and up and down. And then these series of letters come, and they come from prison. And I'm like, prison? And open up that first letter, and this young man starts to write how desperate he is, and how alone he is, and how disappointed he is where his life had turned out. You see, he just couldn't keep his hands off of other people's stuff, big stuff. And he ends up in prison for 5 years in his early 20s. And he begins to write me this series of letters. And there was no doubt that there was a part of him that really wanted to love God, that really wanted to serve God. There was no doubt that the message of Christ had started to penetrate his deep parts of his soul. But I was absolutely convinced that this kid actually loved God. I was absolutely convinced that he wanted more of God in his life. But listen, friends, because I believe that he was forgiven, yes. I believe that he had come into this divine relationship, yes. But friends, there was something that was still broken inside of him. He still had patterns of history and character and flaws and junk and hidden sin all underneath and all undealt with in his life. He was not free on the inside, and that is what took him down. Friends, listen, he was not only in prison physically, but he was in prison in his soul because he just could not yield his whole life to Christ. He just could not come to the point of utterly trusting Christ for God's goodness and God's grace and God's best in his life. He kept taking that back. And I want to tell you the most amazing part of this kid's story is that I don't think he's alone. I don't think he's alone. Some sting operation hasn't taken you down. And you are free, and you can go home at night and put your head on a pillow. But I don't think he's alone in his prison. I think a whole bunch of people in our community, you are still in prison. Free, yes, in the sense that God has forgiven you, but not free in letting your soul follow what God is wanting from you and the things that God wants for you. You're forgiven. You've accepted grace. You know about God. You might even know some parts of him, but you are still in prison. There's still slavery going on. And friends, it is amazing to me. Anybody hear me on this? It is amazing to me the things that we run to thinking that it's going to bring us freedom. It is amazing the things that we hold on to thinking that is going to give us freedom in our life. We rebel against our parents thinking that we're going to be free, but it ends up costing us. Anybody in the room know what I'm talking about? And even now, 20, 30, 40 years later in your life, you are still broken in your relationship with your parents. We rebel against the law thinking that we're free, but you don't beat the law. It catches up, right? It costs you. We do what we want, when we want, with who we want, and in the end, it costs us. And it's funny because as we get a little older and we get a little wiser, most of us learn somewhere along the way that the very things that we run to in order to find freedom are the very things that enslave us. Anybody know what I'm talking about? Anybody start a habit that you wish you could just abandon right now? Anybody have something going around in your mind, your soul, on repeat over and over and over, and you wish to God that you never started it? Come on, anybody? You know exactly what I'm talking about. The things that we run to in order to find freedom are the very things that often enslave us. And the very things that we think will bring us goodness and joy and happiness are the things that often bring us brokenness and guilt and regret and habits that drive us and dominate us. And listen, friends, carefully, because while you and I are searching for freedom with all sorts of things, they are enslaving us. And Jesus comes along and says, it is for freedom that the Son sets you free. He who the Son sets free is free indeed. And the things that you're hoping for in freedom, the cost is too high. He's saying the cost is too much for your life. He says there's another avenue for soul freedom that you need to investigate, that you need to follow. And it's not going to be found in the things of this world. Anybody hearing me? Because those things, the cost is just too high. So if the Son sets you free, listen to me. If the Son sets you free, you can be free indeed. For real, for real. And so here's what we're going to do for the rest of our time, if it's okay with you. We are going to go to the book of John, the gospel according to John. And we are going to do an old-fashioned kind of Bible study. Is that okay with you all? We're just going to read a section, make some comments, try to learn a couple things. And we're going to go to John's book in the 11th chapter. So if you have a Bible app or something like that, or an old-fashioned page thing, which is crazy, you can follow along, and that would be awesome. So John chapter 11, and we're just going to get around this idea that what we're going to call the Lazarus effect. Anybody? The Lazarus effect. Now, some of y'all aren't like clapping or anything because you don't know what I'm talking about yet, but you will know what I'm talking about in a minute, and you're going to clap, and you're going to say, wow, that is the Lazarus effect. And I'm really glad we talked about the Lazarus effect, because the Lazarus effect is going to change my life today. Are y'all with me so far? Okay, so this is called the Lazarus effect, and I'm going to get around two main ideas. I just want you to think about this, maybe take a picture of this, maybe write this down, but two main ideas. And here it is, that spiritual birth is the beginning. Listen, but spiritual birth is the beginning, but spiritual growth is a process. Spiritual birth is the beginning of our relationship with God, but freedom is a process that we have to run after, that we have to purposefully engage. And let me tell you something, friends. When you and I don't know this is you, but if this is you, if you have become a Christian, if that's you, and I don't know if that's you, if it's not you at either of our campuses, we are so glad that you're here. We think you are in the right spot, right? Anybody with me on this? We think you're in the right spot to investigate these things of faith. But I'm going to tell you something. When you first come to Christ, you don't know it all. And you still don't know it all. There's still more for you to run after. There's still more for you to grow in. That is true of me. And when you first come to Christ, let me tell you something. You have not even scratched the full potential of what God's Spirit wants to do inside of you. You haven't even scratched the surface of his strength and what he wants to deliver into your life. Listen, spiritual birth is the beginning, but spiritual growth is a process. It takes a defining moment decision where you yield to Christ, but then it takes something else. It takes a little time. It takes a little effort. It takes a little purposefulness. It takes a decision to keep moving forward. Do not become enslaved again. Move forward. So if you grew up in the church, like I did, you went to Sunday school like I did, and you remember the flannel graph like I do. Anybody? I think we should be bringing the flannel graph out on the weekend experience once in a while. It is so powerful. Some of you have no idea what I'm talking about, but just trust me, it's awesome. But the story we're getting around today is like the big one of the flannel graph world. It is about Lazarus. And so Lazarus is a friend of Jesus, we learn. And Lazarus dies. Now check this out. His sisters are very close to him, and they utterly freak out. Mary and Martha are his sisters, and both just sort of lose it, especially Mary. And you may know this story, but apparently Jesus and Lazarus were really, really tight. They were friends, and word of his sickness, Lazarus' sickness, gets to Jesus. But Jesus, listen, this is very odd. He does not come right away, and that perplexes everybody around him. Everybody expected Jesus to get up and go do something about his friend Lazarus's disease or sickness. right? And that makes perfect sense because why? Word had gotten around that total strangers, people who Jesus didn't even know, would come up to him and there'd be these little phrases like power went out for him, that he would speak a word and that people who were blind, listen to this, people who were blind, everybody started to know this. Everybody, this was like, became common knowledge that Jesus, the rabbi, Jesus, the teacher was coming to town and people better line up because like Medicaid isn't gonna help anymore because he's just gonna touch you and it's like gonna heal you. Like literally blind people who he did not know would receive sight, and deaf people would receive their hearing, and lame people would get up and walk. And so it made perfect sense that everybody around Lazarus would expect that Jesus, because Lazarus is his buddy, would come and do something about it. But Jesus does not come and do something about it. Isn't that a little strange? He hears and he goes, oh yeah. I got it. I'm coming. And they're like, come on, let's go. He's really, really sick. He's gonna die. We gotta go. And Jesus like, I'm coming. I got it. Now listen, friends, by the time Jesus gets there, Lazarus has already died. He's going to the little town of Bethany where they lived. And Lazarus had already died. And so Jesus comes on the scene and into this little town, and there's already a funeral that has taken place. Now, in Jewish custom, they bury their dead very, very quickly, but then have an extended time of mourning. Now, why do you think in ancient days they buried their dead quickly? For obvious reasons, right? You don't even need to have that explained. So they buried their dead quickly, but they go into this process of mourning, these days of mourning. And so when Jesus comes on the scene, Lazarus is already put into a tomb with a rock rolled in front of it, and everybody's crying, and they got the little, after party thing, where you gather your family, the wake is going on, and people are in tears, and they're all sad. And when Jesus shows up on the scene, Mary comes out to meet him, and she just kind of unloads on Jesus, like just literally unloads on him. And he sees that her heart is really, really broken because her brother had just died. And Jesus, we learn something very interesting about Jesus. Not only does Mary lose it, but Jesus loses it. And he begins to react to what is going on. And you got to love this because in the shortest verse in the entire Bible, by the way, 2 words are spoken. And it doesn't say, well, Jesus felt really bad and he teared up. And it doesn't say he was really disappointed that he was late getting there. And it doesn't say that he was really sort of bummed that he missed this big opportunity. No, it simply says these 2 words: Jesus wept. Jesus wept. Now, personally, I really like that because I think some people, even today, you think that God is stoic, that he's uncaring, and that when you hurt, he has forgotten and that he doesn't care. But it says that Jesus comes on the scene and says, no, he utterly wept. He didn't just shed a tear or two, but his body was moved, his emotion was moved, his intellect was moved. It says that he wept over the loss of his friends. And friends, this is saying to me that Jesus experienced the same kind of pain that we experience. Anybody in the room ever lose somebody that you love? And you think that there's nobody else on earth that understands what you've lost. And Jesus says, no, I understand. And so all of this is going down, and you think about this, he gets there and there's loss and he's crying and people are going, why are you crying? You could have came and did something about this. You were late to the party. And you would think that Jesus would come onto the scene and say, hey, I'm gonna fix this whole thing up. Don't worry about a thing. But it doesn't say that. It just says he comes and he weeps with them and he mourns with them. But then something shifts. Because Mary just kind of says, but why? Why weren't you here? And listen to this. This is very interesting. Jesus said, this is to show you the glory of God. He's dead. I think the glory of God would have been really cool if you would have showed up and kept him from dying. And then Jesus says, your brother, listen to this, will rise again. What? Has anybody ever seen a dead person get back up? No. And they're a little freaked out at this. And we're going to drop in verse 32, chapter 11. Listen to this. It says, when Mary reached the place where Jesus was, he's coming into town, and she saw him, and she fell at his feet and said, Lord, Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. We just talked about that, right? Verse 33. When Jesus saw her weeping, and the Jews who had come along with her were also weeping. So this guy's loved, and he was deeply moved in the spirit, and he was troubled, right? Where have you laid him? Where is his grave? Right now he's like, I don't even want to come to the house. I don't want to come to the party. I don't want to freshen up. I don't want to get anything to eat. I want to know where he is. And I'm thinking, this is a really strange deal. Like, you just got here, right? And he goes, I don't even want to stop at the house. I want to go right to the graveyard. And so it says, Jesus says, where have you laid him? And he asks, and then they say, come and see, Lord. And then verse 35, and here it is, 2 words, Jesus wept. He just weeps. Here's this moment where he sees, and he just weeps. And listen to the crowd's reaction. This is very interesting. They say, see how he loved him. Now, that's a little awkward at first, isn't it? Like, see how he loved him. I think what they're saying is this. It's like, hey, they were like more than just Facebook friends. See how he loved him. Like, they knew each other more than just Instagram. It was more than just a like and a little heart and all that kind of stuff. There was a real relationship here. And they were kind of shocked because, I don't know if you noticed this, but a lot of people like to name drop, right? A lot of people go, yeah, we're buddies, we're friends. Yeah, we're old friends, we're great friends. And you hardly even know the guy, right? But it's obvious to everybody looking on that Lazarus, all the rumors they heard about Lazarus' friendship with the master teacher Jesus was absolutely true. And so it says that they see this, but some of them start to talk. And this is how it always says. You can do something great in life, and you can have all the right emotions, the whole thing, and people are still going to talk about you. I don't know if you ever noticed that. It says, could not he who opened the eyes of a blind man have kept him from dying? And what are they saying? They're saying, like, he helped total strangers, but he can't help his friend? What kind of friend is that? And then it says this, once more, Jesus was moved deeply. He came to the tomb, and it was a cave with a stone laid across the entrance. And Jesus says, take away the stone. And people go, whoa, 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 we're really into like doing what you want, but do you know what we're going to find in there? Because it has been 4 days. It has been 4 days. And dead things stink after 3, if you know what I mean, right? And so they say, or Martha says, well, but Lord, the sister of the dead man, but Lord, listen, by this time, there is a bad odor. You don't want to do this, for he has been there for 4 days. And so she was saying, hey, pal, you're a little late for that. Let's just leave the stone where it is. And then Jesus says, don't say, hey, pal, me. Did I not tell you that if you believed, you would see the glory of God? If you would just step up and trust me, if you would just have more than this moment of grace, but that you would trust me, you would see the glory of God in your life. And some of y'all don't know what I'm talking about because you have not yet seen the glory of God in your life. You need to be open to having more of God in your life. Here's what he says. He says, it says this, it says, so they took the stone away. Then Jesus looked up and said, Father, I thank you that you have heard me. I knew that you always hear me, but I said this for the benefit of the people standing here, that they may believe that you actually sent me. So he's like, God, I know what we got going on, and I know what's going to happen. It is not for us, it's for them, because these people seem to need all these signs to believe. That's what he's saying. Listen to this. And when he had said these things, Jesus calls out in a loud voice, Lazarus, come out. Lazarus, get out here. Lazarus, it's time to move. Lazarus, come to me. And then listen to this. The dead man came out. His hands and his feet were wrapped with strips of linen, and cloths were still around his face. Apparently, too many of you guys have been in church for so long that you've heard this story over and over, and you knew the punchline because that was the punchline, and there was nobody saying amen in the house. But I'm thinking when somebody gets out of a grave and comes back and like just a dead man walking, I'm thinking somebody in the house needs to say amen to that, glory to God to that, like, wow, I can't believe that, just something, just react. Just react, okay? And then it says this, Jesus says to him, take off the grave clothes and let him go. Therefore, many of the Jews who had come to visit Mary and had seen what Jesus did, they put their faith in him. In other words, they see the glory of God and they're like, ooh, I think I'm gonna go with the man who can raise other people from the dead. And that makes perfect sense, doesn't it? Yeah. And one of the things we know from history is that those that followed Jesus just kept expanding and expanding because they saw these kinds of things. They knew it to be true. And so I know it's a story that you've heard 100 times, but let me just make a couple of learning observations out of this. Can I just do this? Number one is this. Nothing is impossible with God. Nothing is impossible with God. Here's what's gonna happen to some of you today, is that you're gonna hear this message, and God is gonna stir something in you, maybe again, maybe for the third time, maybe for the first time, maybe for the 100th time, I don't know, but he's gonna stir something in you, and something that is dead inside of you, God is gonna wanna bring to life, and you're gonna go, I need to work on that, I got that, and right now, God's Spirit is gonna start speaking to you, but before you hit that door, you're gonna go, You'll know even before you leave this room that you need to move forward in some areas, that you need to change a couple things. Some of you in this room are gonna go, yeah, you know what, man, I really need to be free. I would love to be free, but by the time you hit your car door, the voice of the deceiver, the voice of the enemy of God is gonna speak to you and say, well, you're the exception to the opportunity here. You know, by the time you get to the doors of this auditorium, that voice of the deceiver is already gonna say to you, you know what, you have tried this before. You have heard messages before. You have heard teachings before. You have heard preachers before. You've heard that silly guy before. You felt convicted before. You've wanted to change before. You've decided before. You dedicated before. You rededicated before. And you know what? Blah, blah, blah. You did that before and it did not work. And before you hit that exit sign, the very seed of faith that God is planting in you right now is going to be stolen from you. It's going to be snatched away from you. And the enemy of God is going to tell you, I'm going to tell you about you. The enemy of God is going to say to you that, well, you're a really hard case. You're an exceptional case. I mean, they can find freedom and you can hear the stories about freedom and you can know like all the things that pastor guy talks about and you go, well, he's free and he's different and there's some good stuff going on in him, but it's not for me because I'm different. You're outside the window of opportunity. And listen, you will even believe that God has freed you at certain points in your life. But now it is just too late. You are who you are. And you can fill in the blanks why. You can say, well, because I've gone too far, because I've been with too many people and I've done too many bad things and I'm addicted, I'm divorced, I've offended God way beyond reason. I've got habits that if you knew about, you'd like fall off that silly chair of yours up there. I could tell you stories about how I just did things that I never ever thought I would do. I know that I'm outside of the opportunity, outside of the window. But let me tell you something, friends, nothing is impossible with God. Nothing is impossible with God. That's what we're talking about here, is that there's nothing that is not possible if you put God into the middle of that mix. And this is more than like a little flannel graph storyboard thing. I mean, these people understood this. Do you realize the reason we know this to be true, the reason we're talking about this today is because this actually happened. And you go, well, how do you know it happened? I'll tell you how you know it happened. It is because when this book was penned and people start circulating stories about Jesus saying, do you remember this? Do you remember this? This is what happened one day. When I was in Bethany one day, I'm serious, I was at this funeral and all of a sudden the guy we buried a couple days earlier, he's walking around. And people knew it. And they cannot argue with your personal story, that what you saw happen. And so all these firsthand witnesses were still running around. And if it was not true, they would have been like, you're talking nonsense, boy. You're just full of it. What are you talking about? But they weren't like that. What we know is that news spread of him all over. And I don't know if you even thought about this, but 2,000 years later, you're talking about him. Right? Nothing is impossible with God. And here's the part of the story that's really cool for me. I don't know if you ever thought about this, but this is like the cool part. This is where it all comes down right here. It is when people say, if you had come sooner. Listen to me. It doesn't matter when Jesus gets there. It does not matter. Well, you say, well, if I only heard his message when I was in high school, it could have saved me a whole lot, but it's too late now. If I would have heard it in college, it would have saved me a whole bunch of sexual weird stuff that I got addicted to, and that's ruined my life in so many ways I can't even begin to tell you. If I would have heard this message before I started my addiction, it would have been different for me. Listen, it would have tricked me. It would have been a whole different deal for my life. If only I had heard earlier. No way. Listen to me. It does not matter where you are in the dying process or if you are already dead in the tomb, whether it's been 1 day, 2 days, 4 days, 4 weeks, 4 months, or 40 years. Because when Jesus comes, when Jesus gets there, dead things come back to life. Things that are broken in your soul begin to rebuild. And there's a new hope and a new direction, because why, friends? He always brings life. And so your story does not scare Jesus. Jesus does not go, oh, I was planning on some good stuff, and then I met her. Can't do anything about that. What? Your story, where you've been and what you have done, does not scare him. He specializes in dead things. He specializes in rebirth. Amen? And here's the second learning real quick, is freedom starts with the voice of Jesus. Listen to me. You're like, yeah, we get it. It was Jesus. No. Lazarus comes out of the grave. And what I'm saying to you is anybody else could have stood at that grave and yelled, Lazarus, come out. And you know what would have happened? Nothing. Oprah could have stood in front of that grave. Dr. Phil could have stood in front of that grave. Lady Gaga, your famous, Hollywood actor, actress, whatever, it doesn't matter. They can yell and scream and they can act in a bunch of movies that they're saving the day, but they are not saving the day. You hear me? Yep. They are not saving the day. Freedom starts with the voice of Jesus. I don't have the freedom word. Your mama does not have the freedom word. Your daddy does not have the freedom word. Culture does not have the freedom word. Jesus has the freedom word in your life. You get to know Jesus. If Jesus comes, no matter how late it is, dead things are going to come back to life. Here's what Jesus said. Jesus says this in the Luke. Luke records this. This is so amazing. He says, the Spirit of God, the Spirit of the Lord is upon me, and he has anointed me to give sight to the blind, hope to the hopeless, and life to the lifeless, to lift up those who are pressed down and done, right? To set the captive, what? Free. Come on. And listen, you can like have all kinds of voices speaking into your life, and you can watch all the documentaries, and you can go to the therapist, and you can read the latest self-help book, you can go to the latest church, and you can hear even guys like me with the best of intentions speaking God's word to you. But until you hear from Jesus, you will stay dead. You will stay dead. You will stay locked in your sin. You will stay locked in your slavery. You will never find all that God intends for you, no matter where you look, because freedom starts in the word of Jesus. And Jesus comes and he says, Lazarus, come out. And I want you to think about this real quick. Lazarus hears this, from the dead, from the realm of the dead. I don't understand it all, but Lazarus is going, I can't come out. I don't even know where I'm at. Listen to me. He's wrapped up in like a mummy, because that's what they did. They wrapped him like mummies back then. You know what I'm talking about? You guys know that? They put wraps around him and they shove him in the grave and say, see ya, right? That's what they do. So he's wrapped up, he's in the dark, and he's like, I hear something, but I don't know where to go, because I didn't let myself in. I can't let myself out. I'm tied up here. And he says, Lazarus, come out. And he's like, why don't you come in and get me? It would be much easier. And you know what? Listen, we have a culture that's like looking for a Superman, a Captain America to come in and move the stone away and wrestle the bad guys down and kill a bunch of people and put the victim over the shoulder and carry him out. But Jesus stands at the edge and he says, no, I think it's a lot better if you come out here. You have to move toward me. I have already done everything to move toward you. And I'm calling you, and you're going to hear my voice, and are you going to respond? Are you going to move toward me? Because if you stay where you are, you will be dead. Because I've already given the command. Something needs to change in you. You need to change your location. You need to change your direction. You need to get out here and do that little mummy dance and get out here. I don't care how you get out here. I don't care if you roll out here, but you got to get out here. And you got to come to me. And so friends, I think the first mark of a true follower of Jesus is something more than just grace. It is more than just forgiveness. It is a soul freedom that has entered this journey where we grow and we move toward the voice of Christ more and more and more in our life. And I hope before you get out of here that whatever is enslaving you, that you will decide to move toward Jesus with that. And that you will decide in your heart before you hit those doors to do business with God and to become more like him, to take your step of faith. Anybody with me?